Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Peter Holland. I'm the Associate Dean for the Arts and have the genuine delight every year of organising the Saturday Scholars Series, which also means I have a perfect excuse to come and listen to some of my most brilliant colleagues talking about their work. So I turn to today, and what I'm pleased to say I think is the best title I've ever seen for a Saturday Scholars lecture. And you don't need me to tell you, because you can read as well as I can, that Thomas Burman is the Robert M. Conway Director, but it doesn't say up there he's the Robert M. Conway Director of the Medieval Institute. Tom Burman studied as a medievalist at what we proudly say is the second best place for medieval studies in North America, the University of Toronto, where he completed a PhD in medieval Spanish intellectual and social history. He taught for 25 years at the University of Tennessee before coming to Notre Dame in 2017 as director of the Medieval Institute. His scholarly work focuses on a wide range of intellectual, cultural, and religious interactions between medieval Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the Western Mediterranean. His first book, in 1994, was entitled Religious Polemic and the Intellectual History of the Mozarabs, from 1050 to 1200, and it examined the learned culture of the Arabic-speaking Christians of Islamic Spain. In 2007, his book Reading the Quran in Latin Christendom, 1140 to 1560, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press, traced the reactions of medieval and early modern Europeans to Islam's holy book, whether they read it in Latin translation or the Arabic original. And it won the American Philosophical Society's Jacques Barzin's Prize in Cultural History. His research has been supported by fellowships from, amongst others, the Rockefeller Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and he's currently writing a book entitled Ramon Martí and the Trinity, Islam, Judaism, and the Scholastic Project. But today, to talk about what happens when a rabbi, a priest, and an imam walk into a coffee shop, please welcome Tom Burman. More light.
I think this is this will do for me. Can you see me well enough from here? I don't want to get up there, and with my bald head, the glare would be really bad news for you. So I think it's just better if we stay down here. I'm setting a timekeeping piece here because Peter warned me that if I didn't stop after 35 minutes, there are going to be a couple of linebackers run down here and grab me. So I want to make sure I'm done talking by then. It's a great pleasure for me to have the opportunity to come and talk to you, and I'm grateful to the college, to John McGreevy and Peter Holland for inviting me to give this presentation. Well, I was rather pleased with my title, and I've been rather pleased with my title all along until this morning, when I realized that someone else had this great idea when I was looking for something on the internet, and I found out that there's been a joke circulating that has done something of what I'm trying to do in this talk, a joke that you can actually get printed on coffee mugs and on T-shirts, and so if you're interested, and it begins, a Muslim, a Jew, and a Christian, and a pagan, and an atheist, they all walk into a coffee shop. They talk, they laugh, they drink, and become good friends. It's not a joke. It's what happens when you're not an oops. It wasn't really fit for a family audience. So somebody got there before me. Now, there's an interesting thing about this format of joke, right? The older version is a priest, a rabbi, and a minister go into a coffee shop, they go into a bar, they go golfing, right? And we have some funny punchline that's a result of their doings together. But what intrigues me about those jokes is they're kind of an admission on the part of North American society that our reality, our social, our cultural reality is one that Protestants, Catholics, and Jews share in, and they share in enough that we tell jokes about it. And what I want to suggest to you today is that a lot of the same thing was true of the medieval world, and especially of the medieval Mediterranean world, this vast territory that surrounded the Mediterranean on both sides. This was a world where, and it's easy to forget this, this is a world that was as pluralistic as ours is, and in some places was a lot more pluralistic. So, for example, if we look at this big area marked out in purple here on this map, this is the area that was conquered in the first expansions of Arab Islam in the 7th and early 8th centuries. We might be tempted to think, well, this is an entirely kind of Arab Muslim zone, but almost nothing could be farther from the truth. Throughout the whole Middle Ages and well into the modern period, into this century in some areas, Islam and Christianity and Judaism shared the same cities. In fact, for most of the Middle Ages, well, at least well down into maybe 1100, 1200, the majority of the population in the Islamic world was actually Christian. And in all of these areas, substantial populations of Jews lived, even up in northern Latin Europe, which was probably the least pluralistic part of this land. So this was an area where, if there had been coffee shops, we could well imagine a rabbi, a priest, and an imam entering them together. There may have been coffee shops, we don't actually know. Coffee began to be drunk in much of this area in the very late Middle Ages, in maybe the 15th century. But nevertheless, there were places that functioned like our modern coffee shops, a kind of a space where people from all kinds of backgrounds of life can interact. And in such places, in fact, rabbis, priests, and imams did meet together and talked a great deal about religion, talked about their own religions and the religions that were not their own. In this talk, then, I want to just briefly touch on four things, four points. First, I want to talk about, well, if there weren't really coffee shops, what were these places where Jews and Christians and Muslims might interact together on a regular basis? And secondly, I want to talk about what the results of this kind of conversation would be. And those results I want to divide just into 3 points, just like a proper sermon, right? You always have 3 points in there. Well, in my sermon, it's going to be that one result was indeed that when people talked about religion across religious boundaries in this period, they could wind up being quite scandalized. A little steam coming out of their ear, foaming at the mouth a bit. That was indeed one possible outcome. But another was that they could become educated. That in fact they entered into conversation with each other in part to become more educated, as we're going to see. And thirdly, we're going to see moments at which, maybe not intending to, but eventually they became edified. They sensed that there was something improving about learning about this other religion, maybe reading its texts. And we have these marvelous moments when the result of this conversation over the equivalent of coffee, it was probably tea most likely, was an experience of kind of spiritual edification. Okay, so now I admit, that's only 2 parts with 3 subdivisions. That's because I had a different organization a little bit earlier today that I said 4. Okay, well, part 1, where were these places? Well, there actually were quite a number of them, quite a number of places where people met across religious boundaries. But one of the most important ones, especially for the subject we're talking about today, was in the courts. Courts of kings, powerful emirs, courts of bishops, the sort of household of a significantly important person was often a place where especially educated Jews and Christians and Muslims might meet each other. One such place is the palace I'm projecting here, a palace of the Norman rulers of Sicily. The Normans, those same people who, some of whom conquered England in 1066, other branches of them went down to Sicily, about the same period, conquered Sicily. These are the ones who, they were kind of the smart ones that go down to the Mediterranean and capture some land rather than the rainy parts of southern England. And Sicily at that point was very Muslim and very Christian, and a large Jewish population. And we know that the dukes and later the kings of Sicily had a court at which they had musicians and scientists and scholars from all three religious traditions hanging about a great deal of the time. As a result of this fact that courts, royal courts or other kinds of courts, were a good meeting place, it's not surprising that one of the earliest accounts that we have of a Christian and a Muslim actually talking about religion was one that happened in Baghdad in the 8th century, when a very important bishop of the Baghdad named Timothy sat down and had a long set of conversations with the Caliph, the emperor of the Islamic Empire, about religious matters. And this thing was written down, survives in a couple of different versions in Syriac and Arabic. So courts are one of the places that we can think of as the coffee shops of the medieval period. Another, and I think this is particularly interesting, monasteries, Christian monasteries. In the medieval Mediterranean, essentially the only monasteries are Christian monasteries. There are institutions that are Muslim that are a little bit like monasteries, but the ones I'm thinking about are Christian monasteries, like the one I'm projecting here. This is one of the oldest monasteries in the world, called Mar Saba. And if any of you have ever traveled to Israel or Palestine, you may have seen it. This monastery is in the Kidron Valley, halfway between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea. And it was founded in the 5th century and has been an active monastery all the way to the present. Well, Islam developed in the 7th century, well after, 150, 200 years later, than the time when this monastery was founded. The early Islamic rulers conquered this region in the 7th century. And so this is a Christian monastery, in other words, and there are a number of other ones like it, that has lived the vast majority of its history under Islamic rule, all the way to the present. It's now part of Palestine. It turns out that monasteries played a very interesting role in the medieval Islamic world. They were old institutions by the time Islam came around. Monasteries tended to practice the convention of hospitality, that if people showed up on their doors traveling through someplace, the monks would let them stay there. And it proved to be the case that Muslims were just as likely to stop at the monasteries as Christians were. And so much is this the case that in Arabic, the word for monastery is dar, and people loved to stop at the Christian monasteries so much that they began, that a genre of literature, of kind of lighthearted stories developed, that in Arabic are called the dayurat, the monastery stories. And these are stories about the fun you can get up to if you go stay with the monks for a while. For one thing, of course, and this, you're thinking, wait a second. I've known a few monks. I don't know. But see, here's the thing. Muslims were technically not supposed to drink wine. I say technically because, in fact, a great deal of wine consuming throughout all of Islamic history. But one place you could go and drink wine and kind of have nobody think it unusual was to a Christian monastery, because they always had wine because they needed it for the Eucharist. They drank wine regularly anyway. So it was kind of a fun place to go hang out with the monks in the monastery. And so it's not surprising that, in fact, another of the earliest accounts that we have of Christians and Muslims in religious discussion took place in the 8th century as well at another monastery in Iraq called Mar Anba. So I might have changed my title to a rabbi, a priest, and an imam going to a monastery. That was maybe the place par excellence for this to happen. And there are other places, by the way, where Jews and Christians and Muslims might meet. One of them is in the marketplaces, because these groups all did business with each other as a matter of course. So what happens when these people meet? They get to know each other. They start talking about their religion. They start reading each other's books. What are the results? Well, one result is that all and sundry could be scandalized by what they found. And I'm projecting up here what is, I think, a good example of this. This is a copy of the earliest manuscript of the first translation of the Quran into Latin. The Quran was translated into Latin in the middle of the 12th century, circulated actually quite widely in Latin Europe in that form. And in this oldest manuscript, the text is surrounded by marginal notes, and some of them are even in between the lines. And these marginal notes, a friend of mine, a scholar, said years ago in an article, were put here to show Christian readers where they should be outraged. Because they never have seen the Quranic text before, and you kind of, you want to make sure that people are getting it. And so right here, for example, we're at the 25th verse of the second surah, and this is the first place in the Quran where the nature of the Islamic paradise is described. And as you may well know, in Quranic terms, paradise is described in a very physical way, with rivers flowing in milk and honey, and there are all kinds of beautiful things to enjoy, including beautiful young women, as we see right here, ac mundísimas mulieras, pure and beautiful women. And the writer of these notes, the Christian writer of these notes, says over here, he wants everybody to know you're supposed to be scandalized about this vision of heaven. And so he says, note that everywhere in this book, he, Muhammad, promises a paradise of carnal delights, just as another heresy did. In other words, here's the Islamic religion, and it's repeating old Christian heresies which also promised such carnal visions of heaven. And these notes go on in this fashion for some time, and eventually, very late in the Quran, there's a note in the margin where you can tell the authors are just kind of throwing up their hands, because they write, nota stultitiam ubique. Notice the stupidity everywhere. Notice the stupidity everywhere, okay? Now, that could sum up this version of, this potential result of interreligious discussion. Notice the stupidity everywhere. Each side saying nasty things about the other, about how stupid everything is, and we can find lots of examples of this. I'll just mention one more briefly, one that may well have happened in front of the beautiful cathedral in Salerno in Italy. We have some remarkable documents in Hebrew from the early 13th or 14th century that recount in Hebrew discussions that Jewish scholars were having with Christians about religious matters. And one set of these is written by a man named Rabbi Moses of Salerno, or Rabbi Moses ben Solomon. And in these notes, he recounts what happened one time when he was discussing that dangerous, puzzling Christian doctrine of the Trinity with these Christians who were trying to persuade him that the Trinity was true. And he gives us the argument, and I'm not going to go into it right now because I'm going to give you one like it in a different context a little bit later. And Moses hears this argument, and he kind of says, well, that doesn't make any sense, because if you're going to talk about a Trinity, and it's very interesting that at this point the document is in Hebrew, but when he says Trinity, he uses the Romance Italian version of it. He just transliterates it into Hebrew, which becomes Trinitat. If you're going to have a Trinity, three persons in the divine being, why not have a quaternitat? Why not have a fourfold or a quintinity? He says in this kind of derisive way. The document is Latin, but we could almost hear him saying the same thing. Nota stultitiam ubique. So this is one possible result, to be scandalized by what you find out about this other religion in the medieval period. And I suppose that if we were left to our own kind of, our own sort of vision of the medieval past that we were that we kind of absorbed growing up, we would assume that, yeah, okay, that makes sense. That's the way medieval people were. And they weren't, I'm here to tell you. But we would assume that makes sense. But we might also assume that that's the only possible reaction that people had when they entered into these conversations. And what I want to stress for the last part of my talk is that's not true at all. There were very different other outcomes of this kind of thing. And one is people could wind up being educated when they talked religion with somebody from outside of their own tradition. What you see here is a manuscript, an early manuscript of a vast commentary. Well, let me back up a little bit. The commentary is by a Christian scholar in 12th century Paris. And it's a commentary on 1st and 2nd Samuel, on a book of the Hebrew Bible, right? And so one kind of way in which people wound up being educated in these conversations is that Judaism and Christianity are related in a way that no other true religions are. And it's one that people often don't think about. And that is, most of the Holy Scriptures of both groups are identical. Right? The Christian Bible is only a small subset of the whole Bible. When Christians hold a copy of what they think of as the Bible, 80% of it is the Jewish Bible. And it's identical to the Bible that Jews have used and continue to use. And this means that Jews and Christians actually are reading the same scripture and have to be interested in many of the same questions about what it means. And this fact has pushed Jews and Christians into what we might think of as study circles over the meaning of the Hebrew Bible for centuries. Even though they disagree with each other about a lot of stuff, they have wound up studying the Hebrew Bible together because they share it. And in fact, anybody know the name? Here's a quiz for you, and I hate to do this before a football game, but somebody tell me the name of the person who translated the Bible into Latin. Jerome. Wow. Can you people come and take my classes? Yeah, you're absolutely. Come take my, yes, Jerome. So St. Jerome, back in the 4th century, translated the whole Bible from the Jewish scriptures from Hebrew and the Christian scriptures from Greek into Latin. And he used a very interesting turn of phrase way back then. He described understanding the Hebrew Bible as getting at the Hebraica veritas, the Hebrew truth of the Old Testament. And that phrase, the Hebraica veritas, comes up periodically through the rest of the history of medieval and later European intellectual history. People go back and seize on that as a kind of a rationale for making close bonds with Jewish scholars to help understand this Hebrew truth. And the person we're talking about today, now, Andrew St. Victor, is one of these. In the 12th century, he was a canon at the Abbey of St. Victor, which was in Paris. It's on the left bank in Paris, the site of St. Victor. And St. Victor, that abbey, was one of the great intellectual centers of European culture in the 12th century. A number of very significant early scholastic thinkers were all connected to St. Victor. And Andrew's particular interest was in literal interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. And when I say literal, what I mean is this. Typically, when early medieval Christians had read the Old Testament, they had been mostly interested in the allegorical meaning of the Old Testament. So what interested them was the way in which, say, the story of Noah and his ark, Noah building this ship out of wood, the ship that could then float on the ocean, the ship in which all of humanity and at least representatives of humanity and of all animals could float and be saved from destruction. What interested them about that story was the allegory in it, which is that this old story about Noah and his ark really could be read as a new story about Jesus and his cross. the ark floating on the waters made out of wood is a type, they would say, is a kind of a foreshadowing of Jesus' cross, which is wood upon which the God-man hung, and that act of hanging on the cross and saving humans is foreshadowed in that event way back in Genesis. And I sometimes try to shock students, it doesn't always work, but I sometimes try to shock students by telling them that in the Middle Ages, for much of the medieval period, Christians weren't very interested in the literal meaning of Scripture. And this was, when I taught in Baptist East Tennessee, that was kind of an alarming thought. They weren't really interested in the literal meaning. They were interested in all these allegorical meanings. Well, one of the interesting things that happens in the 12th century, it's part of the early scholastic period, is that scholars like Andrew suddenly become deeply interested in what the text literally meant. What was its historical meaning? How was it understood by the people who wrote it down? In this case, they would believe that Moses wrote it down. What is the meaning of all of this? And so Andrew worked extremely hard to understand precisely what the literal meaning was. And this inevitably led him into conversation with rabbis. He lived in Paris. Paris had a large Jewish community across the river. And it's very clear that Andrew began to go across the river, meet with Jewish rabbis, ask them what difficult passages of the Hebrew version of the Old Testament meant. He seems to have learned some Hebrew himself. And very often in his commentaries, he actually says, well, traditionally we Christians have believed X about this, but the Hebrews say the following. And so he starts to include in his commentaries references to what the Hebrews, what the Jews believe about things. And this is true even of that verse in Isaiah 7:14. Anybody, can I stump you with this one? Isaiah 7:14. Close. Behold, a virgin shall conceive, right? So here's a place where there's quite a bit of disagreement between Jews and Christians over the meaning of a passage. In Hebrew, it talks about an alma, which Jewish scholars have always said means not virgin, it means young woman. Whereas in the Greek version of the Bible, it says virgin, and the Latin version says the same thing. Well, when he comes to this passage, amazingly enough, Andrew of St. Victor says, well, we Christians say this means virgin. The Hebrews say it means young woman. And he just goes right on. And he doesn't resolve the problem. And this got him into trouble, even with people in his own abbey who said, man, you can't just put it out there like that and not kind of tie it up. I mean, you're going to get into trouble over this. And it was something of a scandal. But Andrew was one of the earliest of a whole series over the course of about 4 generations of remarkably learned Christian scholars who went farther than he did, learned Hebrew extremely well, began not only talking with Jewish rabbis about the meaning of the Hebrew Bible, but then learning how to read Hebrew commentaries themselves. So that what's happening here is an encounter over religion that is not primarily ending in scandal. It might have at times, but ending in one side becoming educated in some kind of useful way, in a way that was very important to them. And by the way, in this manuscript you can see, this is one of the places. This is an abbreviation for the word dicunt. Say in Latin, the Hebrews, Hebraei dicunt. They say it means the following. So even in this image, we have an example of that. Well, we can find the same kinds of things going on in other parts of the Mediterranean world. Here I project the beginning of a section of a work written in about 10th century Baghdad by a guy whose name was Yahya ibn Adi. John is what Yahya means, John, son of Adi. And the last part of his name is a kind of a nickname for him. He was called al-Mantiqi, meaning the logician. So this John, son of Adi, was a great philosopher and a great logician. And like a lot of people in the Islamic world, he wrote a book, a lot of scholars, about a key Islamic question, that is the unity of God, a treatise called Maqala fil Tawheed, the treatise on the oneness of God. And this term, Tawheed, is one of the most important theological terms in the Arabic language, in Muslim Arabic theology. Tawheed refers to the doctrine of the absolute oneness of God. And so the typical thing in medieval Islamic theology was that when you wrote an important theological work, it always had a section on Tawheed, on what the absolute unity of God means. What's very interesting about this case, however, is that Yahya ibn Adi is not a Muslim. He's a Christian, a very distinguished Christian philosopher and theologian who studied with a lot of Muslim philosophers and theologians, taught a lot of them, and lived in this world in 10th century Baghdad where a number of Jewish and Muslim and Christian scholars were interacting at this kind of high theological level. And so when he writes his book about the Tawheed, he kind of takes it in a different direction, as you might think, from the way the Muslims did. In fact, he propounds an argument very much like Rabbi Solomon objected to, Rabbi Moses objected to, that we saw before. He points out, and it's all right here in the title of this section, that the attributes of God, the sifat al-bariya, thalath fakat, that the attributes of God are only three. And what he's doing here is he's playing a fun game with his Muslim friends. Muslim theology, in addition to being preoccupied by Tawheed, the absolute unity of God, was preoccupied by another related question. If God is absolutely one, and in some ways is absolutely other from our experience, can we say anything positive about what God is like? Is there anything positive we can say? And they eventually sort of more or less agreed that there were a handful of attributes of things that you could use to describe God, that God is merciful, God is all-powerful, God is, it can see all things. And so there's this long discussion about attributes, and Christians mostly agreed with all that, and what Yahya does is says, yeah, we agree with you that there are a bunch of attributes. We really, though, insist that they all boil down to just three. In this case, the three of generosity, omnipotence, and wisdom, and mirabile dictu, those are equivalent to the Trinity. So here, our Christian has immersed himself in Islamic theology, long conversations with his Muslim friends, and now he's turned the tool back against them in a way by using their own theological language to express Christian belief. Okay? So there's another kind of education that could come out of this experience. All right. But a further thing that could happen, and it didn't happen all that much, but we have these amazing moments when it did, is that people could emerge from such interactions edified, actually find the religious beliefs and texts of the other group moving in some way. And I think the most marvelous example of this is a guy, a Muslim scholar of the late 15th century in Cairo named Ibrahim ibn Umar al-Biqai. And he was a very important scholar, wrote a lot of works, had a reputation of great learnedness. He also had a reputation for being kind of a daredevil and a little bit of a bad boy in Islamic thought. And one of the reasons he had this reputation is that despite the fact that he was a Quran scholar, he loved the Bible. And I don't think that's too strong a word for it. He loved the Bible. Let me go back from that for a second. Now, I have to stress something here. Though Islam sees itself as coming as the third of these monotheistic religions and sees validity in Christianity and Judaism coming before it, Islam did not do what Christianity did. Christianity took the Jewish Bible and made it its own. Islam did not do that with the Bible. The Bible, the Holy Scripture of Islam is just the Quran. The Bible is maybe kind of seen as important, but it's not embraced and it's not used theologically, or it's not used in liturgy, it's not used in worship, anything like that. And usually, in fact, overwhelmingly, it's not used to help understand the Quran itself. But in his massive commentary on the Quran, Ibrahim here said, not only does the Bible tell us a lot about the Quran, we need to use it intensively to understand the Quran. And he wrote this whole commentary that got him in all kinds of trouble. And along the way, he shows us that he doesn't just find it useful, he finds the Bible beautiful. So after quoting a long passage of Jeremiah, this is what he says: its speech is sublime in its style, exquisite in its tenderness, such that it rends the heart. It rends the heart and makes the eyes swell with tears. We can find something quite similar the other end of the Mediterranean in about the same period, maybe not expressed with such emotion, but something of the same event happening here in this manuscript. This is a copy of that same translation of the Quran made in medieval Spain in the 12th century. This is a copy of it later than the one I showed you earlier. This is from the early 14th century. And I want us to focus on, let me go back. Right up here, you see a little squiggle. By the way, in this case, these are marginal notes that weren't meant to be part of the text. These are the notes of readers who, coming later, jotted stuff in the margins. That was not unusual at all. People wrote in medieval manuscripts all the time. And in fact, I'm personally very glad they did, because it gives me all kinds of useful insight into what they're thinking. And this is an example. So somebody was reading this text, came to this passage up here, and wrote this little squiggle up there. Now let's look at that squiggle a little bit. It looks like it's sort of a thing like a 6 or a B, and then an N. And it is, in fact, a B and an N. And then it has a line through it. And that is an abbreviation mark. One of the pleasures of medieval Latin is that when it's written, it's abbreviated a lot. And all of these little squiggles above words, these are all abbreviation marks, and you're supposed to fill in what is missing there. So our question is, what is missing here? Well, the passage that this is written next to is the 115th verse of the second surah, which is a rather beautiful verse about how to God belongs the Mashriq wal Maghrib, the east and the west. And he is all-embracing and all-powerful. Now, when our 12th century Latin translator got to this passage, he sort of paraphrased it a little bit into kind of equally beautiful Latin, I think. Sua namque pietas nullo modo circumscribitur. His righteousness, God's righteousness, is not limited in any way. He's all-embracing, we might say. Well, what did this guy write in the margin up here? Well, this turns out, and by the way, if you're interested in such things, there are actually dictionaries of abbreviations of medieval Latin that we geeky scholars use. And if you turn to the standard one by a guy named Capelli, you will find that indeed this is an abbreviation for the Latin word bene, which means pretty much exactly the same thing as what bene means in modern Italian. It means well said. It means beautifully done. So here's a 14th century reader somewhere in Latin Europe reading along the Quran in Latin, and we can tell from other notes that he took that he's not especially big friend of Islam or anything, but when he got to this passage, he was moved by it. He was edified by this. He found it something that he wanted to note in the margin that was well said. Okay. We live in an age when there are lots of occasions for Jews and Christians and Muslims to enter into contact with each other. This particular picture is just from earlier this year in the aftermath of the bombing in London when I guess this is Archbishop Welby of Canterbury and a very important British Imam, Sheikh al-Hilli, sharing the stage together to talk about this horrible event that had happened in their life. We live in a world where there are a lot of occasions for people to talk with each other in coffee shops, but also, unfortunately, many occasions when violence and hostility breaks out. And we might well ask, what conclusions can we draw from looking at this distant period, at this medieval past, that might help us? Well, I think one of the main things that we need to conclude from the evidence I've been presenting here, and I think this is so important in an age when, for all kinds of reasons, there's such a zeal to put people in little boxes and to categorize people neatly and simply, that in fact, people are just really complex. They are really complex. And people are not just one thing. They don't just react one way to what's before them. People are capable of being scandalized, but they're capable of being edified as well. And sometimes the same person is equally capable of both. This, I think, in some ways is one of the great lessons of studying the humanities, one of the things we do in this College of Arts and Letters, spending a lot of time looking at what it is to be human and how literary texts show us that, and how music shows us that, and how looking at the historical past shows us that we aren't just simple little ciphers. We are very complicated people, and we need to move forward bearing that fully in mind. And I might stress, since I'm kind of paid to do this as the director of the Medieval Institute, that the medieval past is particularly useful for us in this moment that we live in. There's lots that we can learn. We can, of course, make a lot of bad analogies with the past, but there's a lot that we can learn from looking at the sustained pluralism of the medieval Mediterranean as we go forward into the present. And we might, as a result, all wind up here at the kahwat salam, the coffee of peace, the shalom cafe, the shalom cafe or the peace coffee shop somewhere. God willing, inshallah, as the Arabs say. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'll be happy to answer questions or hear your comments or whatever you'd like. Yes, sir.
First, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
You know, there were plenty of times of conflict, including open military conflict between the Muslim world and the Christian world, not just the Crusades, but my own ancestors, the Byzantines, had their fair share of fights with the Arabs and the Turks, and it didn't turn out so well for us.
Yeah.
In those periods of time, were scholars still as open to communicating with each other, or in times of open conflict, did they tend to retrench and become more partisans for their own side?
It's a very interesting question. Did you all hear the question pretty well? Yes, I mean, in fact, a lot of the most intense interaction between these religious groups actually happened at the same time that intense fighting was happening between them. So, for example, one of the most important moments in the history of Western philosophy and science was in the same 12th, 13th century period when the Quran was translated there. This is the period when Arab science and philosophy and medicine and mathematics were translated from Arabic into Latin by Christian scholars who actually moved to Spain, to Islamic Spain, so they could learn Arabic, learn how to read these texts and translate them into Latin. In fact, the guy who translated the Quran the first time was one of these people. He really was interested in math and science, and a wealthy abbot paid him to do the Quran as well. So that was all going on, this huge transformation, this huge embrace of Arab thought was going on in exactly the same period when the Crusades were fought at the other end of the Mediterranean. And so there were times when it could lead in that direction, And it is interesting, some scholars have pointed out that this translation movement that brought Arab science into Latin happened in Spain, not in the Crusader states, which had been established in less pleasant circumstances. And so there may be some connection there. But in fact, a lot of the most intense interaction happens in times of war. And I think scholars of the history of military history would stress that that's actually quite common. We don't think of it this way, but a military conflict, war is actually an intense interaction with the other. And it tends actually to lead to a lot of investigation with the other, even as you're fighting against them. So that's how I would answer that question. Anyone else? I think I put you all to sleep here.
What drives fundamentalism in many religions?
Well, yeah, boy, if I could answer that one. I would say a couple of things, at least about modern fundamentalism. And remember that fundamentalism as a term is a very modern one. It doesn't exist until the early 20th century. But it's very clear to, and it's a term that was used by Christians for themselves, to start with. And it refers originally to a group of people who were in a very in very basic ways reacting against modernity. In particular, reacting against modern ways of reading the Bible. Reacting against sort of modern scholarly approaches to understanding how the Bible was put together and who wrote the Bible, and modern scholarly approaches that emphasize that the Bible is a historical document and is shaped by its period. And in the early 20th century, a group of Protestant Christians said, no, that's not right, and we have to hold to the fundamentals of our faith. And they embraced that name very strongly. And I think a lot of the historians of that movement, and we have some very distinguished ones here at Notre Dame, one of the other really great areas of scholarship in my own department of history is modern American religious history. I think a lot of scholars would try to understand that as a reaction of fear. There's a great deal of fear of where this might go. I mean, if we keep studying the Bible that way, are we going to wind up treating it as only just one other book among all of the ancient books? And in what sense can the Bible continue to be an authoritative text if we treat it entirely like a historical text? It's kind of scary stuff in some ways. Just as it's scary for modern Muslims to contemplate the Quran being treated that way. So my own sense is that these movements, and one of the things that's very typical of these fundamentalist movements is they think that what they're doing is going back to the way things were in the old days. But many of the features of fundamentalism are very modern themselves. And this is so vividly the case in the Islamic world, where you have people like Osama bin Laden and the people involved in ISIS who are propounding visions of Islam that they say are the original vision of Islam, but they are almost entirely modern inventions. So that the notion that bin Laden put out that it was the job of all Muslims to kill Jews and Christians wherever they found them, utterly heretical in traditional Islamic belief. No legitimately educated faqih would ever say this. But this guy who, in reaction to something in the present, he's invented a vision of his own religion that also is, oddly enough, a creature of the present as well. So I don't think I came close to answering your question there, sir. But I gave it a try. Other questions or comments? Yes.
Just to follow up on that one. When you talk about things being scandalized, education, and edified, wouldn't there be a fourth category?
There might be.
Where you could actually find some integration, that they could work something together, and that it actually could start sort of synthesize new religions or something out of these encounters?
Well, that certainly could happen, yes. There are certainly moments in the history of interreligious interaction where that could happen. Maybe the really interesting case, doesn't quite fit here, it fits with medieval India rather than the medieval Mediterranean world. In India, a whole new religion grew out of a similar encounter between Hinduism and Islam. Right? In the very end of the Middle Ages, in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, we begin to find both Muslim and Hindu poets and kind of gurus, religious leaders, talking in almost the same terminology. So the Muslims are part of the Sufi tradition, which stresses the love of God and the mystical experience of God, and the Hindus are part of what's called the Bhakti tradition, which stresses a similar kind of very affective kind of love of God. And it starts to be the case that when they talk, you can't quite tell which group is which. And so there's even a great poet, and he's revered to this day in India, named Kabir, the poet Kabir. His name is Arabic, it means big guy, which suggests that he had a Muslim past. But nobody actually knows. Was Kabir Muslim or was he Hindu? And his poetry is revered by both groups, and it is in the background of Kabir and some followers of him, including a guy named Guru Nanak, who founded the whole new religion of Sikhism. And Sikhs, are the very, and there are a lot of Sikhs in North America. These are the people that wear the turbans and are unfortunately so often misunderstood to be Muslims. They're not Muslims. They're part of this whole new religious tradition. But that is an example of something that you're talking about, a kind of a fusion that came out of this.
On that line, I have heard that Francis of Assisi traveled to Egypt and Turkey. Is that true? And if so, what kind of interactions did he have there?
Yeah, this is a very kind of famous story. St. Francis did actually travel from Italy all the way to Egypt during the Fifth Crusade. And the Fifth Crusade was another armed attempt to reclaim more territory in the Middle East in the early 13th century. And it was going terribly badly, and it was going to go a lot worse. The Christians spent a long time in a siege in northern Egypt, surrounded by Muslims. And Francis actually went there, talked his way through the lines, got a meeting with the Sultan of Egypt, and we don't know what he talked about. It's clear that they did actually meet. The story took on a life of its own almost immediately afterwards. And the Franciscan order began to say, oh, he went there to convert the Sultan, and it winds up being a scene that's painted over and over and over. You may have seen gorgeous paintings from the Renaissance of this event. We really don't know what happened there for sure. But there were some kind of attempts to try to convert Muslims in that period, though fewer than you would think. What time? Okay.
There's a movie coming out called The Sultan and the Saint. I'm a Franciscan, and it's coming out this fall.
I did not know that.
It's about that exact encounter of Francis and the Sultan.
Exactly.
The Sultan and the Saint. It'll be on PBS sometime soon.
There's a very good book by a friend of mine named John Tolan about all of the various versions of this story and all of the paintings of it. So it's pretty easy to get a hold of if you want.
You said you invited us to your lectures.
Yeah.
Short of paying Notre Dame tuition.
You have to talk to Peter about that.
And I'm a graduate. Could I come to your class for free and listen? Or can I see you online? Or do you guys have lectures at the university that you could come and see, like this?
For example, we sponsor a lot of lectures that are public lectures in the Medieval Institute, for example.
Okay.
There are a number of other kinds of instances in which this can happen. And we have something called the Hesburgh Scholar lectures, right?
We do, but also all the Saturday Scholars lectures go up online. It takes us a little while to edit the filming that's going on now and get it up there. But if you find you miss one and you think, I should have caught that, they will be up online just on the nd.edu site under Saturday Scholars.
Okay. Thank you.
Which sounds like, to me, like a good note to end on, you now see why we were so pleased to prize him out of the University of Tennessee to come to Notre Dame. Thank you so much, Tom Burman.